Listen, over the last 24 hours and certainly overnight, you would have seen um, the extraordinary pictures coming out of China. In fact, it's leading many the conference there, ostensibly the 80th anniversary of China winning the Second World War. Yes, I know, I know, I know, I know, I know. But a whole series of China's of luminaries, and one might argue those seeking to, I guess, challenge the Western order of things, have got together, including Russian President Vladimir Putin, and obviously the North Korean President Kim Jong-un, and a whole series of folk who, well, to be perfectly honest with you, it wouldn't be known necessarily as Democrats. It's true, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's there, but then if I was bordering China just quietly with all their extraordinary military and economic might, I'd be going there too, just to make sure, because as I said yesterday, there's a spotty history between those two, and India's never come out of it well, going back to the 60s, for God's sake. Anyhow, 62 was it? Oh, China invaded them? Anyhow, I can't remember. Sometime around then, and I was far too young to remember it. I must have read it somewhere. But there, amongst all the luminaries shaking hands, were the ex-Prime Ministers of New Zealand, Helen Clark and, as we know, John Key. And you would have heard me opine on this issue yesterday. There's a similar debate, have to say, happening in Australia right now. The Sydney Morning Herald's gone absolutely troppo about the attendance of ex-Australian politicians at this particular gathering, husbanded by the Chinese government, and essentially arguing that they're selling out the West by their attendance. The fact that neither Prime Minister Albanese, despite I understand having received an invite, or the New Zealand Prime Minister not there, is illustrative of the fact that New Zealand wants to keep its distance from that sort of gathering and those sorts of people. And yet there is now the suggestion that Helen Clark, and there's a good debate happening amongst academics in this country as to whether or not Clark and Key are selling us down the country, selling us down the river, sorry, or in actual fact involved in soft diplomacy. In other words, this sort of slightly schizophrenic position that New Zealand has to be vis-a-vis China because, well, they are the largest source of our imports and exports. They make, to a large extent, our economy work. Well, joining us to give us what could only be described as an informed opinion on this, somebody who would have had to deal with this, who was actually under John Key, the senior diplomat, if you like, and has a significant background, and we've had him on the show before, always erudite. We're joined by Tim Groser, and he joins us now. Tim, thanks very much for joining us. Lovely to have you on the show again.
Good morning, Michael. I thought we were talking about climate change and the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, but if you want to comment on this, I'm very happy to do that.
Actually, I do, yes, and then we will move on to the Paris Agreement. But I just wanted to get, just because it's so current and it's leading the world.
I wasn't actually aware that John Key and Helen Clark were there, but assuming that is correct, I'm very pleased.
Looking at the photos, in actual fact, at the moment, Tim. There they are.
Okay.
Yep.
So I'm very pleased they were there. I mean, my view is we are facing unparalleled difficulties. And I know it sounds, the obvious thing to say that every year so you can make this statement. But quite honestly, what is going on now internationally with Trump tearing up the international trading system, withdrawing from agreement after agreement, including the Paris Agreement, we have got to remain in contact with all parties and juggle our way through this. And I don't think we want to be forced into taking sides. So I'm very pleased that we're there.
Well, wait on. If that's the case, then why isn't the Prime Minister or Winston Peters there? Because there was clearly an invitation, or for that matter, the Australian leadership as well.
Because I think there's a very important difference between former Prime Ministers and current Prime Ministers in terms of the political positioning. So I think it's absolutely the right balancing act to have two former centre-left, centre-right leaders there to represent New Zealand informally, but not to speak on behalf of the New Zealand government. And there's no way that the current Australian Prime Minister or the current New Zealand Prime Minister could adopt that position. And therefore, there would be a closer association with some pretty ridiculous things that have come out of that summit, by the way.
Okay, well, can you just very quickly tell me then, if it's okay for John Key and Helen Clark to go, but it's not okay for Winston Peters or Christopher Luxon to go, why? What's the rationale, please?
Well, because they can put distance between being very senior people to put New Zealand into that picture and the actual formal position of the New Zealand government. A sitting leader cannot do that. That's impossible.
All right, so you want to distance
yourself
from China, but you
maneuver.
don't want. Yeah, I know it's a diplomatic maneuver, but it's one of the things that makes diplomatics look stupid, quite frankly, Tim, because in this particular case, Helen Clark says, well, I paid for my ticket myself. And I thought that's interesting. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade didn't. So I presume John Key must have done the same, did he? Do you think?
I presume so. I'm sure he's got the means to do it himself.
Oh, yes, he certainly has. There's no question about that. Listen, just talking about, okay, so go back now to our other one, which is the Paris Agreement. Yesterday I had David Seymour on the show talking about a desire to pressure the current government to pull out of the Paris Agreement. And I have to say, some of those sentiments certainly have been echoed by Shane Jones and others. In fact, they're discussing it this weekend at the New Zealand First Party Conference in Palmerston North. When you've got two coalition partners, both who are starting to see things the same way, and are wanting, and not to pull out, then certainly to review the commitments that have been made, Tim, where does that leave the current national government?
Well, I think both the leaders of the coalition parties know that there's no possibility of Chris Luxon, the current Prime Minister, withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, and I'll give you several reasons why that is the right decision. Sure. And there's not a snowflake's chance in hell of a future left-of-centre government doing so. But there are issues of concern that are driving this around New Zealand, the NDC target, the nationally determined contribution, the continual attacks of climate change ayatollahs on our rural sector and on our agriculture sector. And this is where it's coming from. And those concerns of our rural people who understand how important our agricultural export economy is to the future of this country, they are pretty pissed off, Michael. And that's why you're getting this call. But it's the wrong solution to the right problem.
Okay, so
I can explain why.
Yeah, please go for your life.
Well, it's the wrong solution for multiple reasons, but let's just look at it first in terms of the impact this would have on New Zealand's reputation and feeding into trade agreements. This is particularly important right now as Trump is going around destroying the fabric of the 75-year-old international rules-based system, which means that the network of FTAs that we've developed over the last 40 to 50 years with strong bipartisan support has become even more important than ever. I call it New Zealand's insurance policy. This is not the time to start putting our insurance policy into an open fire. So if you look at, for example, two of the most recent and very important FTAs that we've negotiated, the one with the EU and the one with the UK, there are explicit linkages with the Paris Agreement. I mean, I don't want to bore you, but I could read out the exact language. I've got it in front of me, Article 19.6, that requires effective implementation of the Paris Agreement. So these agreements were deeply unpopular with their rural communities because they saw New Zealand as a threat in Europe and in the UK. The farming lobbies of the UK were completely opposed to this agreement. And if we would be nuts to give them an excuse to walk away from those agreements, particularly in the current deeply disturbed environment of international trade.
Can I ask a question of you? Because I've looked at that, both of those two FTAs. I'm sure you've looked at it in great detail as well. I'm struggling, Tim, on the basis of what they're worth. I mean, I've seen the claims, the rhetoric, but I'm looking at the things that are excluded from them. which is, well, frankly, the things that count and that we get the most money from. And I'm thinking, are they really all that important? Could you give me some clarity on that, please? This is to do with the European
There's,
Union and the UK FTAs.
they're extremely important. The the big shift is with the UK agreement, in my view, but because with respect to the EU, it was built on the platform of the concessions the European Union made to New Zealand. I was our chief negotiator as an official, and I negotiated those agreements personally on sheep meat and on dairy products that ended this continual war against New Zealand that no New Zealanders of the current generation remember. Every 3 years, we had to go and beg on our knees for the right to trade with the
I remember
EU.
that.
So those
Yep.
form the basis of the agreement, and they are refreshed with this agreement. But there are also some useful additions. For example, in seafood and horticulture, basically all the tariffs are gone within a few years from now. With respect to the UK, it's a very different framework there. I am convinced that the UK New Zealand FTA is of immense long term importance to New Zealand for the very simple reason that our whole economy was set up as an offshore farm for Britain. In 1950, 90% of our total exports went to the UK. Today, I think the figure is about just under 3%. And what it will do when it comes phased in over a period of, I think it's 12 years, is will give us an alternative if, for example, China went south. I mean, we're selling more to China these days than we could sell to Europe, but these agreements give us an insurance policy. So I think they're extremely important.
Okay, but here's the juxtaposition that I'm thinking. On the one hand, New Zealand trade officials wrote those Paris agreements in, presumably to meet
Mm-hmm.
the opposition of the farm lobbies, as you say, of Europe and the UK, because you're right, they feel threatened by us. They always have. We go back to the 60s, and you have been around as long as I have, but you've in actual fact been intimately involved. Okay, that's fine. But on the other hand, those commitments under the FTA, particularly with the Europeans and the UK, are now causing problems on the farms and amongst our agricultural lobby, the prime, if you like, supporters politically anyhow of the current government. Can you in your introductory remarks, you talked about the climate change ayatollahs causing problems amongst the New Zealand agricultural sector. Can you please join the dots for me? You've signed that, you've
Sure.
agreed to that,
So
but you're now saying the translation's gone wrong somewhere, has it?